hearable and visible. Just write a little signal in the chat. Welcome to today's webinar on the topic of involving students effectively, what happens and how it improves universities. This session is done in a cooperation between the Magna Carta Observatory and the Global Students Forum, and it's being recorded. Just before we start, I would like to mention some housekeeping rules, which you might have seen in the beginning as a slide. This session, as I said, is recorded. The chat is also recorded and will be kept. However, only the recording of this webinar will be published on our website, so on the Magna Carta website, where you can also find the previous webinars which we have been doing in the series. For the next 1.5 hours, I please ask you to keep both your microphone and your video off. This mainly to make sure that we had a good quality bandwidth for the speakers so that we can see them and interact with them. If you should have any questions for the speakers, we will have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. If it's so that you have a question directly to one of the speakers, please write their name and then the question in the chat box, not as a direct message, but in a public way, so it's easy to collect the questions for the Q&A session at later stages during the webinar. If it should be that you have any problems with the technicalities, for example, that the internet is problematic, or if there is any other issue with the visuals, please write so also in the chat, but address maybe, for example, Magna Carta Observatory, which is the account here, which is our wonderful administrator, Carla, who's assisting us. We also have the help of David John Locke, who is the Secretary General of the MCO, who is able to help if there should be any problems. Before we start, earlier today, I received the number that we will have approximately 71 countries that will be watching this webinar, which is interesting as global or international perspective is what we are going for with this webinar, looking beyond Europe, just in the same way as we're doing with the new Magna Carta Universitatum. This is the 5th MCO webinar, and it's based on the principles of the Magna Carta Universitatum 2020, which will be launched at the next MCO, so Magna Carta Observatory Anniversary Conference, on the topic of university values, responsibilities, responding to the challenges of the future, which will be held virtually between the 16th and 17th of June. Later this year. You're more than welcome to join us for the celebration and the first signing of the next version of official signing of the next Universitatum. It's a big day. This webinar, as I earlier mentioned, is on the topic of involving students effectively, what happens and how it improves universities' international perspectives. And indeed, we will get international perspectives. And this is something we see as fundamental, in particular when reviewing the applications when a university or institution wants to sign both the version of 1988 and the version of 2020. We ask both how many students are in different governing bodies of the institution, as well as what is their role to make sure that there is possibilities. However, how this is then done at the different institutions depends vastly between the different continents that we have. We hope that through this webinar, we can assist in strengthening the student academic freedom all around the globe. My name is Caroline Sundberg, and I'm a member of the Governing Council, and I will be moderating today's session. We will hear 5 different presentations. We will first hear more about the Global Students Forum, who is the co-organizer of this webinar, by Peter Kowasi-Koje, who is the Secretary General of ASU. Afterwards, we will hear a speech from Alexandra da Silva, who is the former student director of Queen's University in Canada, on the topic of recognizing and responding to every form of student engagement. After Alex, we will hear Thierry Lucher, and who is at the Research Department of Post-Schooling and work in the Human Sciences Research Council of South Africa, together with Sepati Mokema, who is a junior researcher in Inclusive Economic Development Division at the Human Sciences Research Council based in Cape Town, South Africa. They will speak on the topic of governance failure and student protests in the case of fees must fall. Last but not least, we will hear Sofia Barona Mena, Research Fellow for RIT Foundation, on the topic of the fight of democracy in Chilean universities, the case of PUC Chile. It's going to be, not to say a very interesting and difficult to get all this information and discussion going. So let me not hold you up here in the presentation part. I would like to leave the floor to Peter to present to you the Global Students Forum. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carla. Sorry, Caroline. I'm attempting to share my screen, and it appears I may have to be made a co-host, okay? Sure, I think I can do that now. All right, Caroline, can you see my screen? Are we good? All right, thank you very much. All right, so as I've been introduced, my name is Peter Kwesi-Koji. I'm the Secretary General of the All Africa Students Union. And my responsibility is to briefly introduce you to the Global Student Forum. And I would want to start by attempting to give us a bit of a background by way of what has pre-existed last year. And we came to a certain realization that preceding last year, other institutions that were involved in academia and others had a global voice. And so we saw that at the teacher union level, they had Education International. At the university and management level, they have the International Association of Universities. At the trade unions level, they have the ITUC. And sadly, at the student level, we have nothing. But that hasn't been the case all along. In 1946, the International Union of Students was established as a voice for students at the global level. However, it will appear that the impact of the Cold War, the student union did not escape that particular impact. And so in time, part of the IUS was funded by the American CIA, and then the other counterpart was funded by the Soviet KGB. That would naturally lead to its self-destruction subsequently. And so it created a vacuum where it was clear that we did not have a global student voice on very important institutions and bodies like the UNESCO, like the United Nations, like the WTO. And that meant that we could not be represented and have a voice in a sense that indicated that when matters of policy relating to education came to the fore, there was a student perspective that would be brought. And so we looked at a number of things that had happened in the time that would trigger us to begin to think about ways that we could get a body that could do exactly that. And one of the very striking things that we thought about was the fact that the WTO, backed by the OECD and the World Bank at a point, created agreements that began to make education to be envisaged in the same way as other tradable commodities are seen. In that sense, you'd see that it has an adverse implication on education as a public good, something that all unions, irrespective of where we are, agree that education at every point in time must be classified as a public good and nothing else. And at the same time also, we began to see emergent perspectives that indicated that a lot of the issues that we face are common. And it indicated that if the issues were common, then we could have a common approach to solving them. We could look at some of them, such as campus-based violence, rising student debt, student accommodation crisis, rising cost of fees, crisis of academic freedom and university autonomy, and racism, discrimination, learning approaches, where we're torn between either we're going for teacher-centered way of doing it or student-centered learning. And so these issues are issues that actually affect all of us, irrespective of where we're coming from. And so we started conversations as to the need to truly have that democratic, representative, and truly global voice that will be able to advocate on a lot of these issues at the global level. And so I'll walk you through what the journey has been. So in April 2019, we began to explore the ways that it would be possible for us to be able to work. And we started conversations between the European student body, the All Africa Student Union, the Latin America Student Organization, the OBESU, which is the European School Student Union, and then the Commonwealth Student Association. So these bodies began to interact and to find ways that we could come together to create that institution and that body that would be able to represent all of us. In June 2019, we met in Accra, Ghana, on the back of the 100 million campaign meeting to discuss what our shared aspirations would be. What would be the tenets that bind us? What would be the commonalities? So once we're able to establish them, we could move forward. In October 2019, in the same year, we toured Europe and the United States. And I see that a couple of my colleagues are equally on the webinar who did a couple of the tours. And the intention was largely to speak to partners, to speak to donors and critical friends who would, as it were, begin to understand that there is a vacuum and we need to fill it with a particular voice. In December 2019, we convened in Geneva, Switzerland, on the sidelines of the Global Refugee Forum, and then subsequently also in Morocco in the same year on the sidelines of the ASU Summit. To culminate that, in February last year, we opened discussions with EI, Education International, on a hosting agreement to be able to give us that sort of structure to be able to move the conversation forward. So fast forward to 2020, the emergence of the Global Student Forum was officialized. And as we speak today, we constitute 183 member unions across 118 countries. Now, this is against the background that these are from the institutions that are one, representative organizations. They are truly independent, they are democratic, and then they are democratically elected at their governance levels. So this would comprise, like I've said, ASU, ESU, the OCLE, OBESU, CSA, and other national student bodies, and in particular regions where we do not have a concentrated. And fast forward also, just to give you a landscape of how the membership of GSF looks like. As of today, we have a strong foothold in Africa, in Europe, in the Latin America, and in the Caribbean. You would realize that membership in the Middle East and the Asia is not one that is particularly impressive. And so in that regard, we'll be doing a lot more networking opportunities and then mapping to be able to get a lot more membership from that region. Now, what is it that what are our core principles and our values? Largely, we were created as that institution that will give the opportunity for student unions to be able to exchange ideas, practices, tactics, and to be able to encourage peer learning amongst ourselves, idea sharing, and the opportunity to be able to build the relationships and the networks that are needed to be able to truly create that body that can create, that can give us solidarity. At the same time, too, we're in opportunities to amplify the struggles of student organizations and movements around the world against issues like rising cost of education, gender, but also to draw attention to student movement that face political oppression, discrimination, and police brutality. We also aim to build the capacity of unions, especially those that are nascent and starting, and those that are weak, to be able to give them a certain structure that makes them formidable. We've also done a lot of work in analysis in terms of research making. And largely, we also undertake a lot of work in advocacy, such that we're able to bring the relevant issues to the fore that matter on rising cost of education, tuition fees, which direction should we go in terms of if we want teacher-centered learning versus student-centered learning, what approaches to pedagogy should we use, etc. So on these wide range of issues, we seem to have been able to put together task teams, working groups, and all of those structures that will be able to on the political priorities that we've had to deal with in the last couple of years, we have been working largely on the COVID-19 pandemic at a truly global level. We've been rallying all the voices of students and young people. We've undertaken a couple of campaigns at the global level to support each other and to provide the solidarity that we need. At the same time, too, what we have done is that at a very grassroots level, we've begun to support our friends, regardless of where they are coming from, and to pool our competences and resources in the areas of democracy, human rights, environmental, and then social justice, gender justice and equality, racial justice, quality education for all, and largely public and policy. Now we have working groups and then task teams that are representative of the geographical spaces on all of these working teams to be able to reflect the teams in the way that it's representative and able to have that sort of diverse thoughts in terms of trying to put together policy. Lastly, in 2021, we've been able to do a number of events in terms of task forces that are working on the priorities, as I've just discussed. We put together some campaigns, some project exchanges, and then in terms of expanding our membership also. I would want to end my presentation, but I cannot do that without acknowledging the 100 million campaign, on the back of whom it's been possible to have an institution like the Global Student Forum. And also I would want to acknowledge the Open Society Foundations for giving the funding grant to start up the organization, and Education International also for providing us with the office facility and other support services. I've given just a bit of a background. It's not exhaustive of everything that I would have wanted to say, but given the constraints of time, I would want to say that you can follow us on Global Student Forum on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, and then YouTube. I'm sure that once you follow us, you begin to see a lot more of what we have done. And I would want to say thank you, and over to you, Caroline, sorry.
No worries, Peter. Thank you very much for your presentation. We have now updated participants list. Please keep your microphone shut off when you're not speaking so we can hear all the wonderful things that our courageous presenters and intelligent presenters have to say during this webinar. I have one question for you, Peter, if I may. What is the biggest achievement so far, according to you, that the GSF have managed to achieve in such a short time, besides establishing yourself?
So I would say that in a very short time from last year, one of the biggest things that I would say that we've been able to do is the campaigns and the people that we've been able to bring together in terms of the critical partners. And so in that time, we've been able to run with the 100 million campaign, the Justice for Every Child. And this is a campaign that has resonated largely on a continent-wide basis, where we have put the issues of child's rights at the center of the discussions. It's something that has not really enjoyed the importance that it deserves. But by virtue of the fact that we were constituted at that time, that has been one of our foremost subjects. And the fact that, I mean, we have used that grassroots and mobilizing ability that we have to be able to, as it were, mobilize the numbers of people to support petitions, to write to their members of parliament, to write to their key decision makers, to take action on a couple of the issues, to be able to give justice to every child. I would say that given the short time, that would perhaps be one of the very significant things that we have done in terms of pulling all of those people together to achieve that.
Thank you very much. I will then leave the floor to our next speaker, Alexandra Alex da Silva, who is the former rector of Queen's University in Canada. Alex, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline. I believe I'm just waiting for control so I can share my screen. And here we go. Okay, perfect. Okay, can everybody see my slides okay? Yes, okay, perfect. So, hi everybody, I won't reintroduce myself other than to remind you that my name is Alexandra and I will be speaking to you about recognizing and responding to every form of student engagement. Peter offered a great global perspective and I'm going to dive deep into the opposite end of things, deep into the governance of the internal side of the university. Oh, so I'm going to change slides. Okay, here we go. So right away, something that folks may have noticed, if you're familiar with the position of rector, is that student and rector aren't usually two things that go together. I am a student. When I held the rector, I was an undergraduate student, and I'm just finishing up my degree now. And at Queen's University, much like almost every other university in the world, up until the 1960s, rector was a position that was held by a friend of the university, likely somebody in government or another important executive office, similar to what we now have our chancellor. In the 1960s, students at Queen's did their first significant push for wanting to have a more significant voice within the university's governance. Different than student government at Queen's is nearly as old as the university and is still going strong. Rector did not come instead of student government, but rather gave the opportunity for a student to sit within all of the governing decisions of the university. So the student rector at Queen's is an elected position that represents the entire graduate and undergraduate population of the university. It is the third office of the university, along with the principal or president and chancellor. And the rector is a member of the board of trustees, is an observer of Senate, is a member of countless committees. As rector, I had the privilege of presiding over convocations and special events, much like other executive administrators within the university. So this is one of the very formal ways that Queen's has created this space for students to be right there in the room where it happens, to have a say in policy development and rewriting, and to not have to find spaces for their voice to be heard within this role. Many of those come naturally with obtaining the position. It is a 2 to 3 year term that's elected by the entire student body. So an election takes place for the student that holds this position. Aside from the rector at Queen's, there are a number of other ways that the university is formally looked to integrating student voice into the governance of the university. I already mentioned Board of Trustees and Senate, but in addition to the rector sitting on both of these bodies, Board of Trustees also has an undergraduate student representative and a graduate student representative. And in Senate, of the 56 senators, 17 are students representing every faculty within the university. And these students have just as much of a voice as their faculty and staff counterparts. Within committees, it would be difficult for me to think of a hiring committee that wouldn't include a student, whether that hiring be for a faculty member or administrator or somebody in student affairs. I myself was involved in hiring the principal of the university that's currently in office. There are students involved in our sexual violence prevention response task force, alcohol task force, and like I said, all levels of policy development and revision, faculty board. And then in addition to these spaces that the university has created for students within pre-existing positions and committees, the university has also taken a strong position of support for student self-governance. So I mentioned that student government at Queen's is very strong and is very significant. And so the university has collaborated with student government on a number of advocacy points, on campus projects, and particularly when it comes to mentorship. Student government at Queen's turnover is very fast. You have students who are in office sometimes for as little as a year, and this is a learning opportunity for students to gain some of the experience that they can't get otherwise. While that poses challenges, it also poses a beautiful opportunity for professional development, and that's where the university has stepped in to support these students. So I mentioned challenges. touching on that a little bit more, much of the structural change that I just talked about is easier said than done. There are a number of considerations that need to come before effectively integrating student voice into university governance. And the first of that is the development of and institution-wide implementation of techniques for achieving this participation. It's one thing to say that you want student voice in the room where it happens. It's another to create these positions, and then to move into the second piece to create this internal culture shift. Like I said, there are challenges that come with having to work with somebody who's only in a position for a year, whereas many staff who are working with these students are there for decades. So working with somebody who's going to be out the door just as soon as they stepped in can be challenging, but you're offering an opportunity to receive the value from that student as fast as possible. So preparing for that quick turnover is a rapid culture shift that has to happen. And then lastly, making it accessible to students. That means compensating students properly, making sure that these positions are realistic for a student workload, making sure that these students are marketed correctly, and that you're reflecting on who these positions are reaching. What kind of students do you see representing these roles within the university? Excuse me. So having discussed a little bit in terms of what Queen's has done to create spaces for students within the university's pre-existing governance model, I wanted to move over a little bit to discussing what happens when you strictly look at that form of engagement as the way for students to participate in the governance of their university. I was very privileged to have the position that I did. It was very easy for me to be able to vocalize the things that I was seeing as a student, but I also had limited scope, and representing tens of thousands of students through one student isn't feasible. You're going to lose value in the process. And by doing that, by defining engagement, you risk denying the complexity. If I stopped 100 people on the street and asked them how they would define engagement, I'm going to get 100 answers. And so by limiting the scope of engagement, you're taking away those opportunities for engagement from 99 of the people who are walking by. What you're also doing is further marginalizing the voices who are already excluded. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more later. Part of that is that you're neglecting the changing circumstances in which people are engaging. Engagement this year, for example, looks vastly different than it did last year around the world. So if we had one rigid definition of engagement, we would be losing value automatically. And you're depriving students of an education in democratic living and how to participate in the governance that's happening around them. And in doing so, you're losing all of this value of students who have things to say and want to participate in making the university community a better place. So I wanted to include this story briefly. On the left is a picture of me delivering my first ever speech to the Board of Trustees. I had the privilege of doing that 8 times in my time as rector. And on the right is a student protest happening on campus. You can't see the magnitude of the crowd from the angle this photo was taken, but this is the largest student organizing that had happened at Queen's in a very long time. There were thousands of students here. The building that this crowd is outside of is actually the building that I'm doing my speech inside of. And the date of the protest was strategically chosen because they knew Board of Trustees was meeting that day. So as this crowd was outside, I was on the inside in one of those meetings. I share this story because the very day that this protest happened, myself and a number of other members of Board of Trustees had been talking about student engagement and kept remarking that student engagement was low. We weren't seeing a lot of student engagement. And then the protest happened and the meeting on the inside carried on very similar to how it had been going on before the protest started. And I felt kind of a fault line shift inside me, recognizing that we were defining student engagement. I was an engaged student as a person in this room because I was filling a spot that had been carved out for me, but these other thousands of students who were engaging weren't being seen as such because of the way that they were doing it. They were carving out a space for themselves. And we were losing value as a university by not recognizing the importance of all of the voices that were right outside of the room where we were desperately asking for students to participate. So that brings me to the idea that student and academic institutions don't always speak the same language. Oftentimes they do, but that's not always the case. So the question then becomes, are we prioritizing these institutional processes over the importance of the contributions students are trying to make in their own way, or over the wellness of those students who are striving to contribute those things? And what's lost when we don't undertake that mission of translating? Because that becomes the question of value. Is it worth it for universities to do this work? Which I strongly believe it is. So these are the types of questions that need to be asked when you're considering whether or not this is work that the university wants to be doing. Now, I would like to kind of point to another resource. I think it's fitting because in my time as rector, I always said that my job was to elevate the voices of others, not to simply push along my own. So I wanted to point to this anthology, Student Engagement in Higher Education, that includes pieces by a number of scholars who can tell you far more about engagement than I ever could in 10 minutes. And this anthology begins with 4 reflective questions that are in front of you now. When administrators and student leaders define student engagement, who are they imagining? And the answer to the questions is that it's typically white affluent students in spaces created for white affluent students. So when we are listening, the question then becomes, who are we listening to? Aside from the fact that it's students in positions that are being created, these are systems that are oppressive in and of themselves. It's students that hold positions because of privileges. And that was the case for myself and many of the students that I worked alongside. One example that I like to point to kind of illuminate the idea that I'm talking about is a pattern of behavior that happened this past summer, where students at universities across North America were creating social media accounts to share instances, particularly of racism and sexual violence that were happening on campus, and students had no other platform to share these stories and really have them be heard. So students were creating their own platform. And the question becomes, how are those stories being shared in this informal platform changing what's happening within the university? How is governance responding to something that is happening outside of the scope of a setting that they've created? So this is the consequence of universities not automatically creating that space for students to share things if they don't hold one of these executive positions. I wanted to start winding down with this quote by the principal of the university that I go to right now and where I was rector. This quote is from his installation, and he finished with the words that he would be committing himself to a world where power consorts not with ignorance and arrogance, but with wisdom, creativity, modesty, and optimism. And when Patrick said those words to the group that was there for his installation, I know everyone was very moved. And I've thought about these words a lot since he said them, about what this world looks like, this world where power consorts with wisdom, creativity, modesty, and optimism. And this is a world that has to include students who are undocumented, students who are Indigenous and disabled, and members of minoritized religious groups. That world where power consorts with creativity includes the voices of all of these students as well. It can't just be for the students who have the privilege of accessing some of these higher up positions. And so I will end with this quote that I came across about a year ago, where a teacher said that the classroom is at best a deferred promise. We aren't yet inhabiting the worlds it invites us to dream up. And that's another quote that I think about very frequently. The question becomes if we are truly committing ourselves to the eventual fulfillment of the promise that we ask students to dream up within the classroom. We have to commit ourselves to the fulfillment of all of those students' dreams. And so that means that we are committing ourselves to thoughtfully and responsibly and intentionally including students in university governance, not as an afterthought, but making spaces for students, like the position of rector, right within those governing systems, that we are amending current conceptions of student engagement and broadening our definitions, and that we are comprehensive and absolute in our commitment to identifying and remedying oppressive policies and practices that suppress the student voices that I've talked about. So I'm at the end of my presentation. I know that was a lot in 10 minutes, but it's been an honor to share my experiences and perspectives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alex. Just a quick question to you too. What is the decision you're most proud of that you're part of taking during the time as a rector when you have that mandate? What is on top of your head?
That's an excellent question. I think in my time as rector, I very much committed myself to like I said, elevating the voices of the people around me, and to try to honestly and authentically bring the perspectives of other people up to the Board of Trustees and other folks who are listening. So being able to do that in all of the policies that I was a part of rewriting, because policy is a language that many students don't speak. So that was for me the decision to really focus on how do I bring students saying things informally and translate into policy change that fulfills the things that they're asking for without knowing how to phrase it the way that the university wants it phrased for it to make sense. I know that's a very broad answer, but it's because that's what happened for so much of my term.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alex. We move from Canada to South Africa, and I want to welcome to the stage Terry and Sepati, who will be speaking about the governance failure in student protest at the case of Fees Must Fall. Terry and Sepati, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
My name is Sepati. I am here with my colleague, Professor Thierry Busha, and we are going to be talking about governance failures of and student protests in the case of the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa that took place between 2015 and 2021. So I'm just going to start off by sharing my screen so that everybody can see my PowerPoint. There, okay. Can you see?
Can you make it full screen, please?
Yeah, is it better now?
No, I mean on the presentation. On the presentation there at the bottom. Yes. Perfect.
Okay, right. So yeah, I'll just continue into it here, right? I'm just gonna go into it. All right. So yes, we have our presentation here, governance failures and student protests in the case of FMF. All right, so in South Africa, we saw the onset of violent protests across South African public universities in the year 2015. These protests were set off by a number of issues that university students had been raising for the longest time, and it just culminated to this outburst of protests. The main reasons that these university protests started was because students had demands which included a decolonized university curriculum and institutional culture, whereby students felt like the university curriculum wasn't exactly meeting the needs of African students, and it was extremely whitewashed, and there was no protest to have the curriculum or the institutional culture of the university to cater to African students, right? So what happened is that we had the Rhodes Must Fall incident or movement, if I may call it, at the University of Cape Town, whereby students protested for the fall of the Cecil John Rhodes statue that was standing in at the upper campus of University of Cape Town. And after that, that sort of like led to other student movement and protests. So this started in the year 2015 at UCT, and then it went on to University of Wits in Johannesburg, whereby students went on to say, we cannot afford university fees. So the government must look into a 0% fee increment that happens on a yearly basis instead of like increasing university tuition fees by 8 or 10% each and every year. The problem with that was that students were then facing academic exclusion because they could not afford. Majority of South African students are from poor and working class backgrounds, and they are either getting the university education through student loans, and it becomes very difficult for them to continue their studies when they don't do well, or they find it very difficult to complete their studies when you find like they don't have money to continue. The other issue was historical debt, whereby students would not be allowed to register when they have accumulated debt on the university bill. So when that happens, when a student goes back to the university in the new academic year to register, then they will automatically be blocked from registering because of that certain debt, and that then results in them not being able to continue their university studies. So this has all been happening between 2015 and 2021. So it sort of like comes in waves, and each and every wave sort of like has the same theme to it, and it has the overall theme is like fees, expensive university fees, and students being kicked out of the university system and them not being able to complete their studies and get their qualifications. Other related protests that we have seen move along with the hashtag fees must fall, which can be found on Twitter and Facebook if anybody's on social media. We use hashtags because mainly these protests were recorded and documented on social media, just to get a bigger audience outside of the university and just to like have the movement spill over into the overall society. So we see the Fees Must Fall 2.0, which was the second wave of the Fees Must Fall in 2016. We have Fees Must Fall Reloaded. We had the national shutdown. We had the Asina Mali, which is a Zulu word for we don't have money. We saw Roads Must Fall, as I had mentioned earlier. We had Open Stellenbosch, which was done by students at the Stellenbosch University here in the Western Cape, who were demanding that students be given access, via like decrease of fees and other related issues that were happening at the university, like the language policy with students from non-Afrikaans speaking families coming into a very Afrikaans speaking institution and them not being able to learn. We also had the Road So White, which is also speaking to the white Eurocentric culture of South African universities. Sizofunda ngenkani is also another South African term, which means that
I think we're running out of time. I think we can't explain all of the different hashtags because we have so many more. Maybe if we can move forward past the timeline, because you just explained it already,
exactly.
and go to the next point.
Yes, exactly. This is part of the timeline. So my next slide is the timeline, which sort of like documents the Fees Must Fall movement from 2015 to all the way to 2021, and all of the major points that came up in the respective years. And these are all the hashtags and all the problems I just spoke about in the first slide, right? So I'm just gonna move past that because I've already like given the crust of it. So yes, what were the costs of the protests? These protests were very violent in nature, and they came at extreme costs, both for university students and the university as institutions themselves. So I'm just going to go through the four main points, and just very briefly, that the personal cost to students was traumatic experiences. Students went on to speak about experiencing like PTSD from all the violence that the police had inflicted on them. They spoke a lot on academic exclusion, that they were not able to go back to university because they had been identified and stigmatized and criminalized because of their participation in the student movement protests. Another cost was academic disruptions. And when all of these protests were happening each and every year, there would be a lot of time lost. Exams would have to be rescheduled. In another university in the country, like the academic year was almost lost, but then the university had to like put in measures to make sure that students sit down for exams and recover what was lost of the year. And the other one is infrastructure costs, the repairs, because I spoke a lot about violence. We found a lot of evidence of vandalism to not student property, university properties. And the Department of Higher Education put out a report whereby universities had to like compile the damage that the amount of the damage university properties occurred between October 2015 and 2016 July, and it summed up to 500 million South African rands, which is about 40 American dollars in damages only. And the last point is security costs. We saw that like because of like how violent the protest became, universities resorted to hiring private security companies to come and guard the property on campuses, and they would put up surveillance equipment to track student movements, and that also came at a big cost, both for students and the university. Okay, so what are the universities themselves, how do they view the outcomes of these student movement and student protests? I'll start with a few positives and then get to the few negatives. The first positive that the student protest achieves was free higher education and for poor and working class students. So working class students, because they are the ones who are most likely to be kicked out of the higher education system, they were then able to get into universities and be able to complete their degrees because of the grant system that was put in place for them to be able to get funding and continue their studies. All right. The other issue that was well taken care of by the protests was how they drove transformation. You know, these movements were really just students letting out their frustrations about the university culture, you know, issues such as racism, issues such as language policy, whereby students are taught in a language that they do not understand. It is not their mother tongue or their first language, it is most probably their second language, and it really put a lot of stress on the students, whereby they could not continue their studies solely on the basis of language being a barrier to them receiving the education. Another one is insourcing of support staff. So it would be staff who are responsible for maintaining and taking care of the university buildings. So there was this policy of getting external companies to hire people to come in, and they would be paid minimum wage, and the workers would not really receive any sort of benefits from working for the private companies. So these student movements also took on the support staff struggles and made sure that if the support staff work for the university, then they can sort of like have their pays raised and they can have benefits like having their children come study at the university that they work at, right? Another last positive is the change in enrollment patterns, because now students were sort of like getting their voices out. We saw changes whereby university fees were adjusted, not by all institutions, but some institutions, as well as teaching methods, because now there's this open communication whereby the university body and the students would like start communicating and come up with plans to mitigate factors that were inhibiting students to receive the education. So teaching methods would like sort of like be moved to accommodate online studies, and then you get like more students being able to enroll and further the education, and you would have students now having the advantage of picking which university they want to go to because of the adjusted fees. So like they could like choose which one is cheaper, which one is more convenient for them to attend. All right, now the negative outcomes of these university protest, as said by the universities themselves, is a psychological trauma suffered by students. Like I'd mentioned earlier, there was a lot of trauma, a lot of PTSD, and this resulted in the need for intensive mental health support services to be offered on university campuses, right? Another negative is prolonged protests that nearly resulted in the loss of academic year, like I also mentioned earlier, that a protest, well, there will be an uprising, there will be a protest, and it will go on for days. And because these protests usually tend violent, students who lived on the university campus would have to leave campus, or the campus would have to be shut down for weeks or months at end, so that the uprising would die down, and there would be like calm, so that the academic year could start again. So this just resulted in a loss of time, loss of resources, and loss of the academic year. Right. And the final negative factor is a decline in income for universities, because now there's a need to reduce university fees so that students who genuinely cannot afford South African higher education must be let into the system. So now universities have to come up with other strategies to get an income and not just rely on government subsidies and bursaries and stuff. So that's some of the outcomes. Yeah, next slide. So lack of responsiveness as governance failures, right? This comes at like two levels. Number one is the institutional level, institutional as in at the university level, because students were not being heard, their grievances were not attended to. Students had to rely and resolve to student representative councils as bodies who would represent their grievances. They had to organize themselves in political organizations. And I think this is a very uniquely South African tradition, if I may call it, whereby you have political parties, and then they would set up student bodies at university campuses. So you will have your ANC student movement, which is like a governing party at the moment, and then you will have all the others also come to university campuses to start student organizations. And then we had the student movement as well, the hashtag fees must fall, the hashtag open Stellenbosch, all the other hashtag movements that we spoke about. Students would then resolve to sort of like affiliating themselves with them so that they can just get their voices heard. And on a national level, we have a student financial aid scheme, that a national student financial aid scheme that is in crisis, whereby you find students are not able to receive their funding when the academic year starts in January. Probably get funding in April, and it sort of like puts an imbalance in, or also like a gap whereby they cannot register in time, therefore they get lost in the system. We have a lot of neoliberal education policies and how universities are governed in the country. So they're sort of like governed not as educational institutions, but they have more of a corporate vibe to them. So yeah, like neoliberal policies, corporatization of public universities, whereby they run as businesses and not as institutions of learning, particularly higher learning, right? Another one is annual fee increments, and these just resulted in financial and academic exclusion. I've spoken about this at length in the presentation. So the higher the fees go, the more and more students are unable to register into universities and get educated and acquire the skills and qualifications, right? And essentially a flawed university funding model whereby, all these neoliberal policies and corporatization and fee increments are just not serving the society, and therefore students or the society at large cannot access higher education, right? So yeah, that's just it of it. Thank you so much for listening, and comments and questions are most welcome. And these will be attended to by partner, Professor Lucia. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I will save the questions for you in the comments until later, so we have the time to also hear Sofia Barahona Mena for on the topic of the fight of democracy in the Chilean University, the case of PCU Chile. We'll attend you and the questions to you, which are quite many I've seen in the chat box, at the beginning of the Q&A session. Sofia, I see that you are ready. The floor is yours.
I think I cannot share my screen though. Oh, I think now I'm the host. Give me 1 sec, please. Okay, can you see my screen? Yes. Okay, thank you so much for being here and inviting me to participate to this interesting webinar. I know that we just have 10 minutes, so I put my name and my email there in case you want to reach out and talk about like education in Chile or anything you'd like to talk. I'm gonna start talking about the fight for democracy in universities, and I'll be focusing in the case of my own university, La Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, better known as PUC Chile or PUC Chile. But just to start, I wanted to give you a brief context on the student movement in Chile and its history, just because all the organization that we already have in universities in Chile, it came from this broad history of student mobilizations. And so I wanted to share the past, I don't know, 4 or 5 decades of history with you. So I wanted to start with the university reform in 1967. That was a movement that was not just in Chile, but also in different countries in Latin America, and where the student led a mobilization to improve the university extension, autonomy, and also democracy at universities. In my particular case, in the case of my university, in 1967 was the first year that, and the only year that we elected a chancellor by the students. After that, as you probably know, we had a horrible dictatorship between 1973 and 1989. And it's pretty interesting because the student had a contradictory role, I would say, during the dictatorship. On one hand, we had a lot of student representatives designated by the dictatorship. That was pretty bad, especially in my university. It was, and it is pretty conservative. So for more than 10 years, representatives were elected or designated by the dictatorship. But on the other hand, and I think this is a more positive role from the students, a lot of student associations fought against the dictatorship and to find the truth behind the lack of respect for the human rights during that period of time. Jumping on the future, between 2011 and 2017, we had massive mobilizations from the students where they were fighting for, like the slogan was, educación pública, gratuita y de calidad. That means free education, public education, and education of quality for all, not just for a small amount of people. And last but not least, between 2018 and the present, we had a strong presence of the feminist movement that has been fighting for more safety and not discrimination in educational institutions, but also, and I didn't put it here in the slide, but we also had a huge social outbreak in 2019, and that was also led by students, not higher education students, but secondary level students, but that's pretty interesting to know. So this is a little bit more focused on my own university. I put the name over there because I know it's hard to understand when I say it in Spanish. But I wanted to share with you 3 things that for me are really interesting of our organization as students. First, the PUC Student Union, FEUC, Federación de Estudiantes de la Universidad Católica, is a pretty well-known institution where I was president of. And more than 50% of undergrad students vote for the student union election every year. So for instance, in 2016, I was elected by more than 6,000 students to be the person who represent them over in front of the authorities and also the government. We have a pretty strong role in any public discussion around universities, state universities, and education in general. And the student union also creates projects to support students, promote public discussion, and build community, not just within the students, but also with workers, faculty, and authority members. We even create projects to work with citizens from the city that the university is on. So it's the work is pretty broad and strong. Also, in my university, and most of the universities in Chile, I would say, every department has their own students associations, and they also represent students from their departments with the local authorities, and all of them are elected by students once a year. And finally, and this is pretty interesting because I think Alex explained a little bit how it worked in Canada, and it's similar also in Chile. Students have participation in the university council. Two students, the president of the student union, and also another students represents the students in a huge meeting with over 47 members. There are department chairs and also authorities, and where they decide basically what's going to happen every year at the university. Until 2018, students could express their opinions, but they couldn't vote. And after 10 years discussing or arguing with the authorities, we finally got the vote. So we finally could have a more active participation on the decision making at the university. And I'm pretty squared in my mind, so I wanted to answer the question of this webinar. What happens when you involve effectively students and how it improves university? And I wanted to share these two main points. The first one is that it visualizes issues that students are facing. Participation in the decision-making process allows the students to bring up issues that they're facing and that the authorities might not be aware of. And I'm gonna show you two examples of this from my own experience as president of the student union. And also the second point is that this supports the authorities and the community to find the best solutions to these issues. Just because the students have their own experiences, they have their own communication, and their individual perspectives, working together with other members of the community makes it easier to find the best solutions for all. And that's the positive thing, to have all of the community members together discussing and participating of the decision making. So these are two of my favorite examples of how student movement can improve work at universities. The first one that I'm really proud of because I was part of it is the protocol to prevent and sanction sexual violence in university contexts. So in 2015, the Gender and Sexuality Secretary, SEGEX, was founded by women and queer students at university. This was a student-led organization to support survivors of sexual violence and discrimination in university contexts. After 2 years of work and a lot of student pressure, in 2017, the university decided to build and write this protocol to prevent and sanction sexual violence. The SEGEX was part of this committee, and the student union was also part of this committee. And I'm pretty sure that without their previous work and this organization, student-led organization, this wouldn't happen. We knew that a lot of cases of sexual violence was happening in the university context, but the university didn't have an institutionalized way to respond to it. So this was a pretty good group that was built. And the other one is the creation of more resources to support students facing mental health issues. After the social outbreak of 2019, there was a lot of violence, different protests. Probably you saw it on the news. And also due to COVID-19, a lot of the students started facing mental health issues. So the student union proposed to increase the university resources to support students in these situations. Before this, we only had 3 psychologists for around 20,000 students. And thanks to the student union and the work with the authorities, that number grew. So that's a really positive effect on our university. And just to, as a conclusion for this, I think student engagement is important to create positive environments for all the university community and all the members of the community. And it is possible to engage students by supporting their own processes. I don't think that authorities needs to lead this, but because I think students really know how to organize themselves, at least in Chile, and they know how to create proposals, lead projects, etc. So I really encourage you to support students, their processes, for instance, elections, events, and different kind of organizations. And of course, supporting that they participate in different decision-making spaces. Yes, so thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Well, I ask my speakers to come back on the stage, which means turning on their cameras, getting ready for the Q&A session. I have a short question for you, Sophia. What is your main don't to universities? Don't do this.
Okay, so I don't know how it works in different universities, but we've seen during the history of Chile, not in the past 10 years or 20 years, that there's a lot of political persecution to students that organize. So don't do that. Just support the students even though you don't share their politics.
Fantastic. It's good advice. As I said before, the first question will go to Sepati and Terry, which was posted in the chat from Matteo Vespa. Matteo is asking, is there a policy to provide higher education also in South African languages other than English? Education is the mother tongue, is human right recognized by UNESCO?
Yeah, hi, that is an excellent question. Well, historically there have been two academic languages in South Africa. The one is English and the other one is a South African Creolic version of Dutch, which is called Afrikaans and is one of the national languages. As far as, for example, isiZulu, isiXhosa, Sesotho, and so far are concerned, indigenous African languages in South Africa, currently the drive is actually to make them academic languages. The language policy, the national language policy says yes. There should be basically all these languages, which are altogether 11. South Africa has 11 national languages plus sign language is recognized as a national language as well, should be able to serve as language of tuition at all levels of education. Now, at this point in time, basically, isiZulu, for example, is used up to about high school level. And there's more and more material being developed, and there are several institutions now who have in their language policy that they want to be more multilingual. And they're starting to do supplemental instruction, tutorials, and so on in languages other than English now. And the idea is that eventually this is going to be mainstreamed and that lectures and also teaching materials will be available not just in English and in some few institutions in Afrikaans as well, but also in isiZulu, isiXhosa, and so on.
I stay with a question to you, which is also a common topic that was mentioned by the other speakers in regards to supporting students' well-being and mental well-being, and in particular for your case, it was the PTSD. My first question, have you calculated, of course it's difficult to calculate on, but measured how much was the impact for the individuals, like both in losses in order to recuperate from PTSD and the crisis, or was this placed on the institutions at least to be able to finance the recovery?
Well, it's only, in fact, it's not even the institutions, it's the individual. I mean, it's the families and the individual students that have to deal with it. And just like what we heard now from Sophia in Chile, the generally speaking, the universities are very under-resourced when it comes to providing student counseling. And it, I mean, COVID is another point in case, but it actually started already in the wake of the large scale protests in 2015 and 2016, that more and more students actually reported with mental health problems. And I mean, it's a global issue. And so there's a lot of awareness now in the universities. In fact, it is as unfortunate as that there have been student suicides, that some institutions started to now realize that this is something which we need to take care of. I'm not aware of any study that has been conducted that is actually costing this, or that actually has been tracing to what extent that the individual institutions have racked up their student counseling centers and employed more counselors and psychologists.
I see you nodding, Alex, from your context, and I know from your current work. Do you have anything to add in this regard?
Like Thierry said, definitely a global issue. I know that Queen's, while I was rector, would report every year on changes in demand and changes on what they were offering, and the increase in demand for mental health support for students was like hundreds of percentages year to year. The demand was exploding. And there was a past administrator at our university who would say that we're not a mental health care facility. That's not our job. That's not our function. But like, as lots of the literature says, students are learning, living, experiencing the ups and downs of life all in one place. And some campuses are very closed off from the rest of the world. That's the case for our university. Queen's is, for lack of a better term, in the middle of nowhere when it comes to Canadian geography. It's very far from a significant city with infrastructure to support what the university can't. So while the university would make strides to increase their support for student wellness, those strides were never enough. I talk about how Queen's has done so much in terms of bringing student voice right into the decision-making processes and the governance, but it's only this year that Queen's is putting together a student advisory board for its wellness services. So they're in the process of hiring students for that right now, so that students themselves can talk about what it is they need, what intake structures are most effective, whether students want same-day appointments or they want to book an appointment that's 6 weeks from now, because those are the types of questions you have to ask when you don't have enough appointments for everybody. So it's definitely a challenge that Queen's is constantly facing, along with most other universities.
Thank you. It bridges me to the question that was for you, Sophia, originally. What measures does your university take to support mental health of students? And is there such a help for teachers?
Can you repeat the last? Oh, sorry. It was for Thierry or for me?
For you, Sophia.
Oh, okay. And can you repeat the last part of the question, please?
The last part of the question that was posted in a chat box by Vladislav was, what measures does your university take to support the mental health of students? And is there such help for teachers?
There is not that such like system for teachers. And basically the university has 3 to 6 psychologists, and each student can, like, if you think you need it, you can apply for that appointment. But as I told you before, it's not really broad, so not many people can access to that. The good thing, though, is that it's cheaper than access a private psychologist than other psychologists out of this system. So that's a pretty good support for students that cannot pay for that service.
Thank you. We will switch topic completely, still staying with the questions that were posted in the chat. And the first question is to you, Peter. So universities should be funded by the entity after all. What do you think of David Friedman's university model? Question from Tamer.
All right, so it's a bit tricky, but I'm not an expert on, university financing and all, but as a student union, the position has largely been that education is a public good. And in that sense, what it implies is that governments have a primary responsibility, as it were, to fund education. But we're also not naive in the sense that we get the understanding and the knowledge that due to the massification of education, increased accessibility will imply that there has to be some public and private partnerships, but that should not in a way be done as to make it impossible for the marginalized to be able to get access to education. So it's a double-barreled, gun in that sense. Whereas we advocate, intensely that education is a public good, we get the understanding that if we're to massify and increase the scale of education such that everybody should be able to get access, government alone cannot do that. And so that means that we need public and private partnerships. At the same time, a safeguard and a constraint must be put in such a way that marginalized and those who cannot really afford it can't get the opportunity to still go to school. So I think that away from being an expert, that's the understanding that we operate from the perspective of being like a student organization.
Thank you very much. Talking about finances, I'm not moving through the main questions from the chat, as you noticed. So we switched kind of still within the theme of finances. Alexandra, are student rectors paid as well as other members?
That would be great. I wish that was the case, but no, absolutely not. And that's one of, when I talk about like the access part of when you're thinking about including students with rector, partially because it wasn't intentional in its design. It was, this position exists and we want to take that position and change it. It wasn't designed for student use. So the compensation for that position was very confusing because originally it was a very small position. And by the time I was elected into office, it was essentially full-time work. And I experienced food insecurity the first summer that I was in the position because I was working full-time and I couldn't take on other employment, and the position did not pay me throughout the summer that year. And that's something that I had to change because it was a barrier to access that I dealt with, partially because I didn't realize I would be dealing with it. And many other students wouldn't have had the privilege to put themselves in the position where they're doing unpaid labor, which was the case for this being an official position. But for other students, they're doing unpaid labor because there isn't a space carved out within the university structure for that labor yet. So they're putting themselves through the emotional turmoil that the other speakers have spoken about, and they're not only not being paid for it, they're suffering for that labor. So the position of rector was not paid like other rectors were, but that it was a work in progress while I was in office that hopefully continues forward. But that's why I talk about the need for being intentional when you create these positions, because the answer isn't creating spaces for students within governance, but taking advantage of students as they do that work for the university.
I have heard stories about similar cases before. Unfortunately, it is a selective procedure by default, which is unfortunate because it doesn't allow for democratic representation. After all, I will take the last question that's actually posted in the chat box, which is from the Secretary General, David Locke, and I will ask you all to briefly answer it before I guess we will have to move to the closing remarks. So the question from David goes like this: it is great that students have had impact on current issues, but to what extent are students involved in future university developments? If not, how might they become more involved? Who is ready to take that question on by David? Sophia, you look ready.
I'm not, but I can try to respond. So as it is right now in Chile, there's not a strong involvement of alumni on the university projects that are happening right now. So it's pretty awful. And I think most of the authorities think that alumni can make a monetary contribution instead of participating in any kind of discussion of what's happening in the university. So I would say, of course, if they have money, they can contribute economically to to the university, and it's important because that's the way a university is sustained, other than a public funding. But at the same time, I would open spaces for having deeper discussions with alumni about what they saw, how was their experience at the university, and how that can be improved in the future. So opening that kind of spaces, maybe not with democratic elected positions, but open positions and discussions, I think that would be a good way to involve them in the discussion. Because I mean, most of us, at least my own experience, I feel really connected to my university, even though I had a lot of arguments with the authorities. We didn't share the same line of thought, but still I feel that it was part of my own life and my own history, so I would love to contribute in that way.
Sepati, I see you nodding. From your perspective, and from what you also heard here today, maybe, how do you see that student can contribute to the future developments?
My goodness. Well, in my experience as a student, and also in my experience as a South African, no, I was noting because, like Sophia was making like a lot of valid points that I like see transpiring in my own background. But for me, it's just a little bit different because we saw firsthand how students took it upon themselves by forming movements, by forming student bodies, by forming even WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups or Twitter movement handles to just like voice it out. So I think if just channels of communication can just be open and remain open, so that there is a dialogue, a space for dialogue between students, the society, and the university to continually talk to each other. That I think the students themselves can just like take advantage of the resources that they have and use them effectively to get not only their grievances, but to, you know, see to it that their own development is as students, as people who are going to build South Africa for the better. You know, they're just heard and taken care of. So yeah, just communications and resources like technology and stuff. So yeah, that's what I think.
Thank you. Terry, I will still stay and ask you, because do you see yourself having a role in this? As you are no longer a student, or you are maybe a student at heart, how can you facilitate?
No, I'm definitely still a student.
No,
yes,
I do. Sorry, Sepati,
no.
You are.
Sorry.
The question was for Terry, not for you.
Ah, okay.
Because sorry.
Thanks, Caroline. I think so far Sepati has done an excellent job to talk and me being quiet. So maybe we should just leave it like that. No, of course, I'm not a student anymore. But I must say, you know, I was a student leader, well, what is it, 20 years ago, in 2000 and 2001 at institution and then at national level as well. And when you look now, I mean, to come back to this question from David, when you look now, the kinds of things that are now changing in policy were raised then already, and it takes so long. So I must say, do the students today have an impact on the future direction of the university, the development of universities? It's like, yes, absolutely. And I think the difference is that when you look at the way universities are governed, it's often actually that it is, well, in the South African context, I would say old white men, you know, who have no understanding actually of what the country as a whole looks like, who represent in terms of their demographic about 4% of the population, and have had a completely different life experience to the point where they become trustees or chancellor, vice chancellors, senior administrators or professors. And that is why, like, when you listen to students and what are the concerns of students now, we said like lack of responsiveness as governance failure. Indeed, not listening to the student voice produces so many governance failures, so many delays in the development of universities, that you know, what Peter is saying, for example, in a massifying higher education system in a developing country like South Africa or like Ghana, for example, you need to listen to the students because students have solutions. He says, look, yes, of course, it's a public good, but we also understand you can't lay all of this on government, on the taxpayer, on whatever. So we need to have public-private partnerships, right? So that is not a model for Norway, you know, for Denmark. It's not the Nordic model. But in the developing country context, you have to become creative. And that creativity students have that. That is lacking, unfortunately. You know, Alex will know that sitting in trustee meetings and shaking her head probably half of the time thinking, when were you born, you know?
That was a good bridge. Alex, what's your take on it?
It's funny, Ben asked a question just after David, and I think Ben's question is the answer to David's question for me. If you ask a student where they see the institution that is their university years down the road, they don't have an answer. If you ask a student where they see themselves or the communities that they care about years down the road, they know the answer to that. And so the question becomes, how do we bridge that gap and make it obvious they're not mutually exclusive? How do we tell students, well, if you care about environmentalism, the university has an impact on that. If you care about the representation and the equitable treatment of queer students, the university has an impact on that. The university's mission and where the university lands itself 10, 15, 20 years down the road impacts the communities that the students care about. So while they don't think about it in the perspective of, you know, what direction do I want to see this institution go in, they're thinking about the same things the university is pondering in these board meetings. It's that mission of translating. Are you creating that opportunity for a space of mutual dialogue where you're willing to say, well, students aren't speaking maybe the same language, but they're talking about the same values at the end of the day. So it's creating that space for making it clear to both parties that these aren't mutually exclusive conversations, that students don't need to be invested in where Queen's University will be 30 years from now to make an impact on the direction that the university heads in terms of what it's prioritizing. So it's an interesting matter of just bringing together things that are the same, but with different perspectives.
Thank you. I will start by closing up and then leave the floor to Peter, who in my world has a great responsibility besides myself in the council, where Peter also will be joining me shortly, but with the Global Students Forum to be able to take it forward and to do something with these outcomes. What I take with me from this fantastic webinar is involving students effectively is quite similar all across the countries that we had, or continents we had represented here today, even if our higher education systems looks very different. They're they're depending differently among student fees. They depend differently on public funding. Some are completely public funded, the institutions, but still the importance is to welcome both the established and the mobilized student voice in a discussion in order to bring it forward. As education, or education as such, is a public responsibility or public good, the public needs to be welcomed into the dialogue to be able to co-govern. I see this as the good handover to Peter. The floor is yours. Your closing remarks. What will happen next? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Caroline. And let me use the opportunity to say thank you to David, to Carla, to yourself, and to Sebastian. I mean, even as he's not here, he's been immensely helpful in trying to put this together. I do think that how we can move this forward is, in summary, what the last four speakers have said, except to say that at the global level, I think that how we can move this forward is to see increased student involvement in the decisions that are made. And so to what extent, for example, are we engaged productively if we want to say that we want to privatize education, we want to consider education as a tradable commodity? What are the constraints that we're going to put on that? Where are the bricks? And so for me, how we move this forward would mean that as students also, we have a responsibility to, as it were, participate more. And so if we drift out of the space and we don't engage, or I mean, for example, we're asked to give evaluation after exams, or we're told to evaluate our faculty members, and then a lot of students, for example, will not evaluate. They will not fill that forms. And I'm going like, if you don't evaluate them, how do we increase, quality? So the extent to which we tend to participate is the extent to which we'll get better outcomes. And so how we move this forward is that if we're asking students to come on board to do a lot more of the things, that will ensure that the good that we seek out there is a two-way thing. There's a faculty and there's a student. And incidentally, we see education is pretty different by way of itself. Unlike how, for example, if you walk into a restaurant, you are just a consumer or a customer. In education, you are both that customer, the consumer, and you are part of the process. So you cannot exclude yourself from any point in time in that whole, sequence of interactions and engagements. So the message will be that we'll encourage a lot more of the students to be participatory, not to be spectators. And to the extent that we all want to come on board, I'm sure that we'll be able to build an institution that recognizes that everybody's involved, everybody's perspectives are taken in, and I'm sure that the world will be a better place if we all decide to get involved. So those should be my closing remarks, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you everyone who have listened here today. Thank you very much to the panelists for sharing your thoughts and ideas. And I hope that you will join us for the next webinar coming up short in time. More notifications will be sent over email. Thank you very much for today. Goodbye.